Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I'm returning to the new Polytheism by David Miller, but I want to address the appendix, which is an essay by James Hillman. And it's a fairly long essay, long enough for me to focus just on that today. And it presents a more psychoanalytical study of polytheism. And it's pretty interesting. But it still, nevertheless, follows along some of the themes that we get very often from the psychoanalytic school, insofar as that it really talks about the self and the inner psychology of the individual, which is fine. That's what James Hillman, he's a psychoanalyst and he's a Jungian, and, psychology focuses very much on the inner life of the mind, and that's where he's coming from. But as I said in previous episodes, I think that it would be interesting and helpful to look at polytheism and mythology from the perspective of the group, by which I mean the society, the nation, the community, the ethnos, the tribe, the people, in addition to looking at this stuff from the perspective of the individual. And we kind of get two ways of approaching it. If you look at it metaphorically, then you tend to look at it from a psychological standpoint, from an archetypal standpoint, and you tend to look at it from the perspective of the individual. Whereas if you look at it from a more society-based social grouping perspective, you will approach it more as a religious question. Do people believe in the gods? Do they worship the gods? Go through the rituals? Is our religion monotheistic or polytheistic? And so the minute it kind of escapes from the individual mind and goes out into the group, it transforms from the metaphorical to the actual, and we begin talking about what people's actual religious beliefs are. And that's understandable because religions tend to be social. Not many people really have their own personal private religion. It's derived from things they've heard elsewhere. They may have their own take on things, but generally speaking, your religious beliefs are bound up with the society that you're a part of. Now, if you read about religion, like say you read about Buddhism and decide that you're a Buddhist, but you don't know any Buddhists, in the modern world, religion can become more personal, and someone might practice Buddhism in their home and not have it be a shared tradition with other people, and that's becoming more common. But it's also kind of odd and historically abnormal. Historically, you wouldn't have one person in a community who practices a completely different religion than everybody else without generating some suspicion. But we don't live in those times, and everything is in flux in the present era. Everything is on the table. We're in strange times, and there are a multitude of very serious threats against Western civilization. And so, in a sense, I don't think we need to really be extremely bound by the way things used to be done. Every tool is on the table. So, in any event, I want to jump in here and look a little bit at Hillman's approach to polytheism and monotheism and how that relates to psychology, and it'll at least help us understand some of the issues that come to play when we have these sorts of conversations. Because I know that I'm online and I see that there are a lot of people who on the right who are advocating for a sort of return to paganism. A lot of people on the right. Now, maybe this is just the peculiar corners of the internet where I hang out, but there are a lot of people online that are basically saying Christianity is inadequate to the moment that we find ourselves in Western civilization, and Christianity bears some culpability for the situation we're in, and that we need to try something different, and that something different is ancient European paganism. That kind of a belief system will help us find our way through. And I think that there are some very serious and legitimate support for that viewpoint. Christianity does not seem to me to be adequate to the moment. And I'll get into that a little bit more in some future episodes and some criticisms of how Christianity has contended with the challenges of the present. But I don't want to make that case today. But what does need to happen is that we need to think about this sort of thing. We need to think about religion. We need to think about whether, just from boiling it down to a real basic question, is polytheism or monotheism or some hybrid of them or neither, are any of these things going to help us in the present moment? Are these useful tools for us? Or are we wasting our time even talking about this sort of thing? Maybe this is just a diversion from talking about real-world stuff that needs to get addressed, and here we are talking about the gods. That's a legitimate criticism, I suppose. But nevertheless, it's a conversation that's happening, and so we should approach the conversation from a position of being informed. If you're a listener of the show, you know that I'm a materialist. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the gods. But I am partial to paganism because I'm partial to some of the pagan virtues, and I see them as a decent potential replacement for some Christian values and virtues that I think are not helping, are provoking a sort of complacency and weakness among our people. So there are some aspects of paganism that I think are certainly beneficial right now. But I'm not ready to take the plunge and start talking about the spirit world or magic or any of the other things that tend to get bundled up with paganism. So at any rate, I'm going to read a little bit of this essay here. Like all my episodes, I've got a few sections I want to read. I'll provide a little bit of commentary. I don't think I'm going to provide a tremendous amount of commentary here. I think I've said what I need to say. But we'll look at what Hillman thinks about polytheism and monotheism insofar as it can be understood psychologically. So, talking about the views that we have as a society about monotheism and about polytheism, he says, quote, the question, polytheism or monotheism, represents a basic ideational conflict in psychology today. Which fantasy governs our view of soul-making and the process of individuation, the many or the one? The very sound of the question shows already to what extent we are ruled by a bias towards the one. Unity, integration, and individuation seem an advance over multiplicity and diversity. As the self seems a further integration than anima animus, so seems monotheism superior to polytheism. Placing the psychological part of this question to one side for the moment, let us first depose the ruling theological notion that in the history of religions, or in the ethnology of peoples, monotheism is a further, higher development out of polytheism. Paul Radin devoted a monograph to this subject. He concluded, as most ethnologists and unbiased students would now admit, the possibility of interpreting monotheism as part of a general intellectual and ethical progress must be abandoned. He argues forcefully and cogently against the evolutionary view that monotheism emerges from or is later or higher than polytheism or animism. Radin bases monotheism not upon developmental stages, but rather upon the idea of temperament. Some people everywhere are by temperament monotheistic. They have a monotheistic psychology. All the monotheists, it is my claim, have sprung from the ranks of the eminently religious. Such people are admittedly few in number. It is the characteristic of such individuals, I contend, always to picture the world as a unified whole. These are the theological thinkers, a small elite in any culture, sharing a common temperament, and their influence upon their brethren in the same culture is stubborn and effective. The inexpugnable persistence of monotheistic religion could be psychologically accounted for by Jung's theory of the self. Then we might be tempted to conclude that monotheism is so strong because it is the theological equivalent of a more complete, integrated, and powerful numinous psychic condition. But already two objections crop up. First, Radin says monotheism has obviously not been the triumph of the unifying principle over the disruptive. I take this to mean that religion and social order and disorder, unity and disunity, cannot be correlated with monotheism and polytheism. Second, to base the strength of religious monotheism upon analogy with the psychologically more complete state of the self begs the same question which is nowhere established, the superiority of monotheism to polytheism. Persistence does not necessarily demonstrate the superiority of monotheism, nor even its victory. Gray points out that two varying attitudes toward God can exist at one and the same time. The monolatry of Yahweh did exist among the Jews, even as late as the exile period, side by side with the worship of other deities. Despite the historical evidence of religion, there is a fond notion, without adequate foundation, that monotheism is the pinnacle, and that the evolution of religion thus manifests, it would seem, a definite tendency toward an integration of our mental and emotional life. Jung may not be borne out by the historical facts of religion, but he is borne out by the psychological bias of the historians of religion, who put monotheism on top in the name of integration. Two examples help to show this bias toward evolutionary monotheism. In his examination of the decline of Greek religion, Nilsson finds the movement of religion from single, well-delineated gods to a multiplicity of powers and daemons, a degeneration. The magic, superstition, and occultism that prevailed in later periods was, according to Nilsson of Protestant Sweden, a disintegration. A century earlier, Schelling fantasied a vague monotheismus, which developed later into a clearly formulated monotheism of the Old Testament as the highest product of religious consciousness. Between the first, primitive monotheism, and the later highly developed stage, there occurred Babel, which, for Schelling, represented the incursion of polytheism. The hypothesis of the superiority of the self and monotheism over anima animus and polytheism finds companions among historians of religion. Consequently, Jung's hypothesis may be one more expression of the theological temperament. This temperament has been more narrowly described as introversion, for Jung writes, "The monistic tendency belongs to the introverted attitude, the pluralistic to the extroverted." As in other areas of human activity, Jung sees the two tendencies in theology, where they are expressed as monotheism and polytheism, to be also in constant warfare. Neither of these two attitudinal tendencies is superior to the other, and neither is an evolution of the other. They are givens, and given as equals. End quote. So there we saw an extended quote where he's talking about how society views monotheism and polytheism, and Jung himself, he seems to indicate at points that Jung himself has this same sort of thing. Jung's theory of the self, the theory of individuation, the theory that the highest form of a self is a unified self. The more we can achieve oneness and unity, the greater off we are, and the sort of plurality. And I'm not sure why he uses anima animus as a demonstration. I think there are a lot of archetypes that are spoken of in Jungian psychology, and I think what he's really talking about is the notion that our minds are comprised of a plethora of different complexes that are competing with one another, are working in coordination with one another, but are all sort of sharing the stage in the spotlight at different times. And we wind up with a mind that's sort of fractured and fragmented, and that's an inferior state, whereas once everything is unified as one, we become integrated, we become complete, we become whole, and that's the superior state, whereas the fragmentation is an inferior state. And this is a bias that we've carried through history. It's in our studies of our historians, it's in our theologians. The superiority of monotheism over polytheism, the idea that, in some will say we started out as polytheistic and then we evolved into monotheism. Others will put forward the theory that we started off with a really kind of original monotheism. This is, I think, Schelling's theory of the vague monotheismus, an early monotheism, and then a refined later monotheism, and in between is the Tower of Babel, where polytheism reigned. So, it's a starting off in a correct state, a superior state, degenerating into a polytheistic state, and then re-evolving back toward a higher monotheistic state. So this is just the bias that we see in all throughout our civilization towards this type of thing. So we'll just leave that there and move on to the next section, where he gets a little bit into more detail about polytheism in psychology and archetypes. And he says, quote, Jung used a polycentric description for the objective psyche. The light of nature was multiple. Following the traditional descriptions of the anima mundi, Jung wrote of the lumen naturae as a multiplicity of partial consciousness, like stars or sparks or luminous fish eyes. A polytheistic psychology corresponds with this description and provides its imagistic formulation in the major traditional language of our civilization, i.e., classical mythology. By providing a divine background of personages and powers for each complex, polytheistic psychology would find place for each spark. It would aim less at gathering them into a unity and more at integrating each fragment according to its own principle, giving each god its due over that portion of consciousness, that symptom, complex, fantasy, which calls for an archetypal background. It would accept the multiplicity of voices, the babble of the anima and animus, without insisting upon unifying them into one figure, and accept, too, the dissolution process into diversity as equal in value to the coagulation process into unity. The pagan gods and goddesses would be restored to their psychological domain. We would consider Artemis, Persephone, Athena, Aphrodite, for instance, as more adequate psychological backgrounds to the complexity of human nature than the unified image of Maria, and the diversity expressed by Apollo, Hermes, Dionysus, and Hercules, for instance, to correspond better with psychological actualities than any single idea of self or single figure of Eros or of Jesus and Yahweh. Not that Maria, Eros, Jesus, and Yahweh are false, far from it, but only that they, like Zeus too, tend to present themselves in descriptions which dominate through unification, thus losing the values shaped by each of the other gods and goddesses. Focus upon the many and the different, rather than upon the one and the same, also provides a variety of ways of looking at one's psychic condition. There are many avenues for discovering the virtues in a psychic phenomena. Depression, say, may be led into meaning on the model of Christ and his suffering and resurrection. It may, through Saturn, gain the depth of melancholy and inspiration, or, through Apollo, serve to release the blackbird of prophetic insight. From the perspective of Demeter, depression may yield awareness of the mother-daughter mystery, or through Dionysus, we may find depression a refuge from the excessive demands of the ruling will. This emphasis upon many dominants would then favor the differentiation of the anima animus. Quite possibly, and now this is my claim and contention, closer interest in a variety of divine hypostases and their processes displayed in myth will prove more psychological, even if less religious, in the monotheistic sense of religion. This interest will more likely produce more insights into emotions, images, and relationships, even if it will be less encouraging for a theology of evolutional wholeness. It will more likely reflect accurately the illusions and entanglements of the soul, even if it satisfies less the popular vision of individuation from chaos to order, from multiplicity to unity, and where the health of wholeness has come to mean the one dominating the many. Polytheistic psychology obliges consciousness to circulate among a field of powers. Each god has his due, as each complex deserves its respect in its own right. In this circularity of topoi, there seem no preferred positions, no sure statements about positive and negative, and therefore no need to rule out some configurations in topoi as pathological. Pathology itself will require a polytheistic revisioning. When the idea of progress through hierarchical stages is suspended, there will be more tolerance for the non-growth, non-upward, and non-ordered components of the psyche. There is more room for variance when there is more place given to variety. We may then discover that many of the judgments which have previously been called psychological were, rather, theological. They were statements about dreams and fantasies and behavior, and people too, coming from a monotheistic ideal of wholeness, the self, that devalues the primal multiplicity of souls. End quote. So here you see some relationship between psychology and polytheism, and he's referring specifically to what he calls polytheistic psychology. And he's saying that, this sort of polytheistic psychology would aim less at gathering the various components of the mind, the various archetypes. They would be integrated into the mind, rather than gathering them into a unity. He says it would aim less at gathering them into a unity and more at integrating each fragment according to its own principle, giving each god its due over that portion of consciousness, that symptom, complex, fantasy, which calls for archetypal background. So recognizing the various parts of a person's mind with, sort of being represented by various gods. He does say that, he says a polytheistic psychology corresponds with this description. He says a polytheistic psychology provides its imagistic formulation in the major traditional language of our civilization, i.e. classical mythology. So polytheistic psychology draws on classical mythology to name the different components and to come up with stories and ways of interpreting the different parts of our mind. And he kind of examines depression briefly and says, we can look at depression in the model of Christ, or we could look at it in the model of Saturn or Apollo or Demeter or Dionysus. There are different ways of seeing what depression is, what it is for, how best to confront it. When we have a plethora of stories, none of them right or wrong, just available for us to use to analyze depression or to analyze our minds, our various hang-ups. We can draw on a rich tradition of mythology to help us explore these parts of our minds. So I can really appreciate that. But let me keep going. He talks a little bit about the relationship between psychology and theology, where he says, quote, monotheism or polytheism, self or anima animus, pose still another either-or, theology or psychology. Traditionally, psychology deals with the second order of things, i.e. the emanated world of flux, diversity, and the phenomenally imperfect. Its concern has traditionally been with the actualities of the soul, its modes of existence, its fantasies, emotions, and experiences, whereas theology considers the soul eschatologically from the viewpoint of self. Wholeness, defined by psychology, means everything, all the phenomena as phenomena, things as they present themselves. Wholeness, defined theologically, means the one, things as they are in God. From this difference can arise two views of completion: a psychological wholeness, where individuation shows itself as being what one is, as one is, in multiple relations, and a theological wholeness, where individuation shows itself in degrees of approximation to an ideal or unity. The more I am occupied by the anima or animus, the more I will be concerned with the welter of psychological phenomena. The more I am occupied by the self, the more I will show concern for goal states, peak experiences, and universality. From this superior vantage point, Babel and the proliferation of cults in the Hellenistic period always seems a degeneration. Likewise, an animist court and its ambivalence, or the multiplicity of dream women, become but an inferior prestage of unity. Remember how the prophets warn against the promiscuity and harlotry of Israel. The many-faceted world of Olympus must fade before a single God, even if in three persons. One might, however, consider the proliferation of cults as a therapia, worship, service, and care of the complexes in their many forms. Then one could understand the psychic fragmentation supposedly typical of our times as the return of the repressed, bringing a return of psychological polytheism. Fragmentation then would indicate many possibilities for individuation, and might even be the result of individuation, each individual struggling with his daemonies. If there is only one model of individuation, can there be true individuality? The complexes that will not be integrated force recognition of their autonomous power. Their archetypal cores will not serve the single goal of monotheistic wholeness. Babel may be a religious decline from one point of view, and it may be a psychological improvement, since through the many tongues a fuller discordant psychic reality is being reflected. So the current delight in superstitions, astrology, witchery, and oracles has a psychological significance, even if they be considered inferior religion. Through these images and practices, anima-animus aspects of the psyche begin to find traditional reflection and containment in an impersonal background. Without the gods, who offer differentiated model for the peculiar psychic phenomena of anima and animus, we see them as projections. Then we try to take them back with introverted measures. But the individual ego is much too small, its brain much too feeble, to incorporate all the projections withdrawn from the world. Ego and brain burst asunder in the effort. The psychiatrist calls it schizophrenia. Without a consciously polytheistic psychology, are we not more susceptible to an unconscious fragmentation called schizophrenia? Monotheistic psychology counters what it must see as disintegration and breakdown with archetypal images of order, mandalas. Unity compensates plurality. Polytheistic psychology would meet this so-called disintegration in its own language, by means of archetypal likeness. Like is cured by like. Each particular phenomena in an experience of breakdown would be viewed less in terms of the construct breakdown. Instead, it would be led back to its archetypal source, and the idea of breakdown itself would be articulated more precisely in terms of the hero, the pure, Hermes, Dionysus, Demeter, and their differing styles. There would be less need for compensation through opposites. End quote. So that's a little tricky there. Some of it is kind of technical terminology. He talks a little bit about the proliferation of cults in the Hellenistic period, and how, from the theological perspective, that seems like a degeneration. He says the many-faceted world of Olympus must fade before a single god. But then he says one might consider this as worship, service, and care of the complexes in their many forms, so that the proliferation of different cults is providing avenues for the different psychological components to manifest themselves and to be recognized. In which case, he says, one could understand the psychic fragmentation, supposedly typical of our times, as actually it's the return of the repressed, bringing a return of psychological polytheism. So the extent to which we feel like, we're fragmented, we feel like we have this mental health crisis or whatever, we feel like we're alienated, we feel off, we feel like disassociated, when we have all kinds of mental health issues, right? People have their issues. He says, in a sense, that what we're really seeing is the return of a repressed polytheism, a repressed psychological polytheism. It's not really fragmentation, it's a different type of individuation. It's a form of things coming to the surface that need to be recognized, that have been repressed in our psyche for a very long time. And he says basically that the individual mind, he says the individual ego is too small to incorporate all of these different components. And he says ego and brain burst asunder in the effort, and the psychiatrist calls it schizophrenia. He says if we don't have a consciously polytheistic psychology, then we become susceptible to fragmentation and susceptible to schizophrenia. We haven't given the other parts of our own minds an avenue to manifest themselves. We're constantly after that oneness. We're constantly after that unity. We've so demonized the concept of fragmentation. We've so demonized the idea of multiple personalities and everything else that other parts of our minds, other aspects of ourselves, never get to see the light of day, and they things repressed manifest themselves in unhealthy ways if they're not given healthy avenues of expression. And so we get schizophrenia, we get mental health crises and everything because the parts of ourselves are not being recognized, because we refuse to see ourselves as plural, as having different parts. And we could stop thinking about things like psychic breakdowns and fragmentation, and we would be thinking in terms of the presence of the gods manifesting themselves within us. It's a different approach to the mind. Anyway, moving forward a little bit, he talks a little bit more about the concept of monotheistic psychology, where he says, quote, "The theme, monotheism, polytheism, is immensely complex and packed with energy. The best minds of the early centuries of our era were obsessed with this issue, and from that conflict of paganism with Christianity, our historical psyche and our psychological theory have been cast in what eventually became the current Protestant direction. The essence of this direction reflects the Christian victory over the pagan world, which can be summed up in a phrase from Gregory of Nazianzus, who, while praising the pagans for their culture, epitomized the method for integrating it into Christianity. We take prisoner every thought for Christ. The one God swallows all the others. Pan was dead because monotheism had conquered. The variegated natural totality, or pan, of the pagan world's modes of being, together with their attributes and traits and kinds of consciousness, were taken prisoner through binding them to the one central image and myth. Monotheism fed like Kronos on the gods it swallowed. As Christianity swelled, imprisoned Greek philosophy, read psychology, sank exhausted into the arms of religion. Even were we to grant that this historical event was beneficial for religion, and there are others besides Nietzsche who would grudge any value to this victory, it was not necessarily beneficial for psychology. This because specific patterns of consciousness were deprived of their archetypal backgrounds and imprisoned by the Christian model, whose perspective now made them seem pathological. They could return, but through the back door of mental aberration. A pathological view towards many of the psyche's phenomena is inevitable if psychology does not keep alive the individuality and variety of archetypal forms, and their different ways of viewing the soul and life. Remember, even Christian alchemy warns against conjunctions and unifications that create the monstrum, that is, psychic monstrosities. Should psychology prefer instead to merge the many ways into a wholeness determined by monotheism, ego towards self, single one to single one, will it not too, has it not already sink exhausted into the arms of religion? The Protestant direction of analytical psychology crops out in many large and small ways. Currently, we see it in the emphasis upon love as a panacea, without differentiation of the phases of love, and awareness of tradition in regard to its constellations. The merit of hard work upon oneself, the inculcation of a strong ego in therapy through the ennobling of choice, responsibility, commitment, and the consequent manipulation of guilt, trust in simplicity, naivety, and group emotion. An anti-intellectual, anti-logos bias where trust or pistis in the unconscious or the process is enough. Or, as the reverse of pistis, a clean scientistic objectivism, together with the classical worries of capitalism, payments, contracts, clients, laws, insurance, emphasis upon revelation from dreams, from oracle, imagination, psychosis, analyst, or from Jung, a peculiar combination of introverted religiosity and missionary popularization. We see it as well in the soul model for psychological suffering, in which death's value is dislocated onto rebirth, a linear process of gaining a better condition in exchange for a worse. This model fundamentally devalues the existential importance of depression and the descent into dissolution per se. Downward phenomena are good, not in themselves, but rather because they offer hope for resurrection. It appears especially in the theological obsession with evil, which, let us recall, was not an issue in Greek polytheism. The Greeks had no devil. Each form of consciousness had its specific component of wrongdoing and tragedy. Evil was not a separate component, but a strand, so woven through everything that the integration of the shadow was already given in the patterns of life, rather than a task for an ego to do. And the Protestant direction appears in the notion of the ego-self axis, the confrontation between them, the new midpoint as a new covenant, and Christ as a paradigm of the individuating ego. When our model of individuation is governed by monotheistic psychology in its Protestant direction, every fantasy becomes a prisoner for Christ. Every fantasy cannot help but find meaning in terms of the one path, like the pilgrim on his progress towards integration. Even those that do not willingly fit in can be taken prisoner through the idea of a pagan anima, a chthonic animus, a pure inflation, or the problem of evil. These concepts bind psychic events to the dominant myth of the Protestant direction, where once science and then clinical pragmatists were the enemies of the psyche. Today, the threat to the psyche's freedom of symbol formation is nothing else than fading Christianity coming back in the guise of a theology of the self to claim the soul for its own. Releasing the swallowed gods, or the prisoners for Christ, means realizing first how limited must be our hermeneutic for psychic phenomena when we have a simplistic monotheistic model for totality. Jung has pointed out that the extermination of polytheism goes hand in hand with the suppression of individual fantasy, and as the Christian idea begins to fade, a recrudescence of individual symbol formation may be expected. We may draw the conclusion that individual symbol formation requires a polytheistic psychology, because the symbols refer to their likenesses in the variety of archetypal forms through which they find their authentication. Did Jung foresee that his stress upon totality and wholeness could be turned by the influential monotheism of our culture and thus lead to a new one-sidedness? End quote. So there's a little bit about monotheism, monotheistic psychology there. Important points. Starting off, he says, this is a quote from Gregory of Nazianzus. That's a hard word to say. Nazianzus, who said that we take prisoner every thought for Christ. The one God swallows all the others. The idea that Christ and Christianity take everything into itself. Everything that you think, everything that you do is aimed singularly towards Christ, towards Christianity, towards God. And he also draws the kind of example of Kronos feeding on the other gods, Kronos eating his children. Although it's a little different because Kronos is the parent and Christ is not the parent of the gods. But as a concept of one entity that consumes all the other gods, one religion that takes everything else into itself and reanalyzes and re-understands everything in its own singular terms, is an interesting one. And he says the advent of Christianity and the victory of Christianity over paganism, regardless of whether it was good or not good for society, he says it wasn't necessarily good for psychology because specific patterns of consciousness were deprived of their archetypal backgrounds. So, this is a kind of reiterating the same thing in different words, that there are parts of us, parts of our minds, parts of our mental framework, our archetypes, that get imprisoned, that get repressed, that don't have ways of expressing themselves. He says the Christian model perspective makes these seem pathological and they can return, but through the back door of mental aberration. So again, if parts of the mind are not given the opportunity to act and speak and participate, then they become repressed and they come through in unhealthy means rather than healthy ones. And he calls it a sort of Protestant direction, this aiming all aiming in one direction at Christ. And he points out some things in psychology that might at first glance not seem like quote unquote monotheistic, but in a way it is. The emphasis upon love as a panacea without differentiation of the faces of love and awareness of tradition in regard to its constellations, the merit of hard work upon oneself, the inculcation of a strong ego in therapy, and either a singular trust in faith or a singular trust in science, either one, sort of the same type of monotheistic psychology. And also as the concept of having a psychological ladder where he talks about rebirth, a linear process of gaining a better condition in exchange for a worse. So you give up something that you were and you become something new, but you're never more than one. In order to gain the next step on the ladder, you have to step off of the prior step. So you're only ever at one step at a time, step by step in an upward direction. There's no multiplicity. You're never on multiple rungs at once. That whole concept of inner multiplicity is deprecated, is discredited and discarded. And also he talks about the concept of evil. And in Greek polytheism, he says the Greeks had no devil, but evil wasn't really a separate thing. It was a strand woven through everything. Every form of consciousness had its specific component of wrongdoing and tragedy. So it was a strand so woven through everything that the integration of the shadow was already given. The shadow was a part of every god had a potential dark side and a potential light side. There wasn't one single god of evil. They didn't isolate it like that, but it was error. It was more considered error and mistake and a singular type of depravity where, there's many types of depravity and each of them can be associated with one of the gods in its dark aspect, perhaps, or in its, if a certain god not being represented in a person's religion, that God would come through. And there's stories about this in mythology where, the gods repressed. So the god uninvited still finds a way to make its presence known. The point being that every one of these gods has some aspect of darkness in them, but there is no singular god of darkness. So anyway, let me jump to the next section. Talking a bit about trying to reconcile the monotheistic and polytheistic psychology. He says, quote, "The task of psychology, let us stress, is not the reconciliation of monotheism and polytheism, whether the many are each aspects of the one, or emanations of the one, or its hypostases and persons, is discussion for theology, not psychology. So too, attempts to integrate the anima animus into the self, as, for instance, the notion of stages, tend also to be theological. They present theories in the senex mode for integrating differences into a single order. The result generally disfavors the plurality of individual differences, and precisely these differences are what we wish to keep in mind, following one of Jung's definitions of individuation as differentiation. Therefore, polytheistic psychology does not focus upon such constructs as identity, unity, centeredness, integration, terms that have entered psychology from its monotheistic background. Instead, a polytheistic psychology favors differentiating, elaborating, particularizing, complicating, affirming, and preserving. The emphasis is less upon changing what is there into something better, transformation and improvement, and more on deepening what is there into itself, individualizing and soul-making. The way out of the polytheistic monotheistic dilemma is perhaps less theoretical than empirical. Which pattern offers my psyche, in the mess of its complexes, better options for meaning? Heuristic, pragmatic criteria have always been decisive in choosing between rival structures of consciousness. Constantine became Christian, and through him our civilization, because the new monotheistic religion then offered redemption to lost areas of his psyche, which the paganism of the time could not quicken. The pagan cults were nothing but a confused medley, very loosely bound together by the customary dedication to all gods. They had no common organization, and tended to break up into their atoms. The independence of the Greek city-states, and of the Renaissance Italian cities, the cry of liberty in the name of paganism during the Romantic Revolution, as well as the contemporary separatist movements, show on the political level a psychological disassociation away from central authority. Translating these polytheistic and separatist phenomena into a psychological metaphor, we have Jung's vision of the objective psyche where the atoms reflect the multiple sparks. Monotheism evidently provided Constantine's psyche with the central focus then needed. Today, may not the situation be the reverse? Can the atomism of our psychic paganism, that is, the rash of individual symbol formation, now breaking out as the Christian cult fades, be contained by a psychology of self-integration that echoes its expiring Christian model? If so, then indeed the self is the archetype which is most important for modern man to understand. The answer hangs in the historical balance, and the scale, so loaded with recrudescent individual fantasies, is surely tipping away from monotheism's definition of order and its imago Dei. The danger is that a true revival of paganism as religion is then possible, with all its accoutrements of popular soothsaying, quick priesthoods, astrological divination, extravagant practices, and the erosion of psychic differentiations through delusional enthusiasms. These opium poppies bloom all around us. The self does not provide bulwark, since its monotheistic descriptions, mainly in Senex images, and the Protestant interpretation leave too much out, or cover too much, by the comforting blanket of wholeness. But when self can be reimagined with precision, as a value relation with a variety of ambiguous archetypal perspectives, and less assuredly through the Senex, consciousness can find containers for its individual self-formation. To meet the revival of paganism as religion, we need adequate psychological models that give full credit to the psyche's inherent polytheism, thereby providing psychological vessels for the sparks. They may burst into religious conflagrations when left psychologically unattended, or when forced into monotheistic integrations that simply do not work. The restoration of the gods and goddesses as psychic dominants reflects truly both the varied beauty and messy confusion and tragic limitation of the anima animus, their fascinating multiplicity, their conflicts, their lack of ethical cohesion, their tendency to draw us deep through life and into death. Polytheistic psychology can give sacred differentiation to our psychic turmoil and can welcome its outlandish individuality in terms of classical patterns." End quote. So, of course, there's a lot in that section. Let's see what we can make of it. The psychology's job is not to reconcile monotheism and polytheism, and in a sense, he says, trying to reconcile these things, trying to attempt to integrate the anima animus into the self, which is a sort of reconciliation of the two, really is sort of theological, and it presents theories in a Senex form, Senex meaning the sort of wise old man. This integration is itself sort of monotheistic and somewhat theological. He says this result disfavors the plurality of individual differences. He says polytheistic psychology doesn't focus on things like unity, integration. These terms have entered from the monotheistic background of psychology. Polytheistic psychology favors differentiating, elaborating, and particularizing, so there's no real need to try to integrate these two into one conception. He says the answer to the way out of the polytheistic-monotheistic dilemma is more pragmatic. Which pattern offers my psyche better options for meaning? He said Constantine became Christian because the monotheistic religion offered him redemption to lost areas of his psyche that he wasn't getting from paganism. And there's a quote here, and I believe, I'll double check, I guess that's from Al Foldy, someone by name of Al Foldy. So I guess it's not actually like a quote from Constantine or anything, but there's a quote where he says, "The pagan cults were nothing but a confused medley, loosely bound together by a customary dedication to all gods. There was no common organization, and they tended to break up into their atoms." So there were, in a way, that's sort of a weakness. It was in that period in Rome, it was sort of a medley. There weren't well-defined boundaries as to which gods were part of the pantheon and which ones weren't. There was a blurry dedication to all the gods. And so there were some weaknesses in paganism at the time. At any rate, he says today, maybe the situation is the reverse of Constantine's. And he says basically, is it possible for the different parts of our psyches to be contained within the Christian framework or within the monotheistic psychology? And what's interesting is he says that the scales are tipping away from monotheism's definition of order. He says the danger is that a true revival of paganism as religion is possible, with all its accoutrements of soothsaying, astrology, blah, blah, blah. So he sounds as though he doesn't think that a revival of actual religious paganism is a good development. All sorts of strange cults can arise, all sorts of extravagant practices and snake oil salesmen and who knows what can come about as a result of that. And of course, we do see within the pagan community, there's no real structure or organization, very little, and groups and ideas and authors just sort of pop up, and where do they come from and what are they all about? It's there may be potentially some downsides, but I think he really doesn't. Like I'm a materialist. I'm not a spiritual pagan in the sense that I believe in the gods as supernatural things, and I certainly don't believe in magic or soothsaying or divination or astrology or other things like that. But I'm not like deliberately hostile to the revival of paganism as a religion. I think it's probably a helpful development. Ultimately, what I would like to see is a sort of atheopaganism, a recognition of pagan values without the mumbo-jumbo accoutrements of the spirit world and everything else that goes along with it. But I'm not like directly hostile. But he basically says that in order to contend with the revival of paganism as a religion, we need psychological models that can adopt the polytheistic drive so that it doesn't get channeled into religion and it instead gets channeled into psychology. He says to meet the revival of paganism as religion, we need adequate psychological models that give full credit to the psyche's inherent polytheism, thereby providing psychological vessels for the sparks. They may burst into religious conflagrations when left psychologically unattended, or when forced into monotheistic integrations that simply do not work. So there's a clear sort of hostility to that potential. So anyway, let me jump forward to the next section that I wanted to read. He talks a little bit about William James, which I appreciate. And he doesn't go on too long here, but I do want to mention this section because, as you know, I'm a fan of William James. So I want to see what he has to say here. He says, quote, "When William James described a pluralistic universe, he set this sentence in italics. Reality may exist in distributive form, in the shape not of an all, but of a set of eaches, just as it seems to be." Then he added, "There is this in favor of eaches, that they are at any rate real enough to have made themselves at least appear to everyone, whereas the absolute, wholeness, unity, the one, has as yet appeared immediately to only a few mystics, and indeed to them very ambiguously. Eachness, that is the place I share with James, and with Young, for what else is individualization but a particularization of the soul? For James, eachness is not so much achieved through an individuating process as it is already there just as it seems to be. James plays his eachness on a blue guitar, things as they are, the blue bush of imagination inextricably embedded in the plain sense of things. Only with these individual eaches can we be intimate, says James. The pluralistic vision opens towards intimacy, love, in the immediate green world of the senses. Oh, taste and see. As Young said, the archetypes cannot be understood without the feeling function. Psychic life is particularized in the veil of the world, and this veil is endlessly alive with qualities and embeddedness of concretely felt individualities, which are not at all sufficiently described as the 10,000 things, atomic particles, plurality, the many, or by any of the other terms of perception theory, psychic physics theory, or religious doctrine enunciated by a detached monotheistic consciousness that sits in judgment so far above the veil that it seems only unqualified statistical data, a blooming, buzzing confusion of quanta, faceless and threatening. Here within and below, we are embedded in immediate contexts, and the idea of the many only serves to sever us and the strings of the guitar. The many is a defensive idea against the experiences of things as they are. The hat you're wearing, the pain in your eyes, my last dream this morning, the dog scratching her collar. Each image holds itself together. Gone the fragments, the bits, and so gone too are the needs for a unified worldview, and a unified personality to uphold the world, and a self to hold it all. Each event showing its own face is the way the world comes and our lives are, and these events have a kami, a theos, bespeaking the holiness of things as images of gods. Too quickly, we monotheize this images of gods, as if the images were one-to-one representations, mirror images of actual gods we admire in a museum statuary, as if we had to match eachness with its multiple background. End quote. So there's a little bit of James, and he refers to James's book, A Pluralistic Universe. I haven't actually read that book yet. I've started a little bit of it, and I can assure you, is coming down the pipeline as a future episode, but I haven't finished it yet. But I'm certainly familiar with James's idea about the one versus the many, and James says, there's a quote from A Pluralistic Universe where James says, reality may exist in distributive form in the shape not of an all, but of a set of eaches, just as it seems to be. There is this in favor of eaches, that they are at any rate real enough to have made themselves at least appear to everyone, whereas the absolute has as yet appeared immediately to only a few mystics, and indeed to them very ambiguously. I really like that quote from James, because I think it's incredibly true and important that in the world, like you're here in the world, and you experience things. He talks about the dog scratching its collar, the dream he had last night, the things. I sit here in my chair, I have a microphone in front of me. Those are things. I live in a world of things. And although I can conceive like the world as a whole, and we talked about this a little bit with Heidegger, all of these things exist in the world as a whole. They exist within, the universe as one thing. And we immediately understand that all of these things, although I'm in a world of many things, they're all here together, right? But the oneness of everything, really truly like singularity of everything, is something that we either have to theorize or is a vision available to mystics that, someone comes down from the mountaintop and says, all is one. But firstly, as James says, it's ambiguous, it's vague, and it's not all the same. The manner of oneness is not all the same. We get different types of visions of what it means for all things to be one. And it's not apparent, it's not obvious to us that there's a real deep unity that in some way supersedes the multiplicity of things that I have to contend with every day. I'm in my life contending with stuff. I'm not contending with oneness. I can go through my whole day and never even think about the oneness of the universe, but I'm here always dealing with each thing as it presents itself to me all day long in every moment of my life. And the other thing that he says that's important, I think, is how we talk about the one and the many. When you speak about the many, they're all atomized. They're all things. None of them, you haven't pointed anything out. You haven't said this and this and this and that, but you've just said the many, the multiplicity, the things. Totally undifferentiated, really. Just each one is for purposes of the exercise. Everything is just a unit, the collection of units. So that's sort of seen from without. That's seen from above. That's like there's the one on the one hand, and then in contrast, only really to be understood as a contrast to the one, we have the many. If you're not comparing each thing in your life, if you're not aggregating them all and setting them up as a contrast to the one, then you don't really think about the world and the things as the many, the multitude, the things. Not really. You think about, it's like a fish in water. You just assume you're in a world of things, and your only concern is with these things, this thing, each thing in its own as it presents itself to you, and not, quote unquote, the many. So that's an interesting aspect of that as well. And just to close things out, a somewhat brief section where he says, quote, I have spent so many words on theological and philosophical aspects because this is a postscript to an addendum in a book by a professor of religions. The book's concern is a theological revision. Still, my concern is more the revisioning of psychotherapy. A polytheistic model of the psyche seems logical and helpful when confronting the many voices and figments that pop up in any single patient, including myself. I can't even imagine how we could ever have got on in therapy without a polytheistic background. For a long time, I was not able to understand why clinicians had such an investment in the strong ego, the suppressive integration of personality, and the unified independence of will at the expense of ambivalence, partial drives, complexes, imagos, vicissitudes, to say nothing of hallucinations and split personality, until I heard, sounding through this clinical language, the ancient and powerful basso profundo of the One. Clinical rhetoric has been so persuasive, especially when lent a helping hand and brass knuckles by clinical pharmacology and the legal system, because it speaks with the superior rhetoric, that rhetoric of superiority, of monotheistic consciousness. In clinical situations, this consciousness reinforces the notion of the I. And then, what else can the gods do but become diseases, which is where Jung found them. This is also where William James found his plurals, his eaches. End quote. So that's, obviously a very brief, but I thought it was important. He says that he doesn't even know, he can't imagine how we ever got on in therapy without a polytheistic background. He says a polytheistic model of the psyche seems logical and helpful. And he says that he wasn't able to understand why clinicians were so invested in unification, the ego, suppressing the partial drives, suppressing the complexes, downgrading them as pathologies. He didn't really understand why this was all about the unification of the self, the unified independence of will, until he heard sounding through that clinical language the ancient and powerful basso profundo of the One, sort of philosophical dedication to unity and oneness, the one of the world, which is philosophical and is also theological. It always waltzes right into theology when you start talking about the One. It waltzes into mysticism and theology. And what's interesting, he says, this rhetoric has been persuasive, but it's also been lent a helping hand and brass knuckles by clinical pharmacology and the legal system. And he says this consciousness reinforces the idea of the I, and then what can the gods do but become diseases, pathologies, all of the multiplicities of things, again, degraded, downgraded into diseases, when they really should be elevated as gods. So I thought that was interesting, and that will do it for now. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.